Hi everybody, this is my second video. This is on the French Revolution and Napoleon. I'm going to do my best to keep this video at 15 minutes or less, but it's a really big topic, so I may go a little over. It's an important topic too. It's very often a topic that you can discuss in a thematic essay, so I really recommend taking a look at my website and going through this topic in more detail. But in this video, I'll go over the major highlights that you absolutely need to know about this topic. All right, first things first. Before the French Revolution starts, you have what's known as the old regime, okay? Under the old regime, you have an absolute leader, Louis XVI. Louis XVI is in charge, and the rest of society is split into three estates. If you see that triangle picture, the first estate is the clergy. That's the religious figures, specifically Catholic Church figures. Second estate is the aristocracy, the nobility. These are your landowners. Third estate is everyone else. So that includes rich, middle-class business owners to the poorest peasant starving to death just getting by, all right? So if you added the first and second estate together, that's about 3% of the population. 97% of the population is shoved into the third estate. All right. The problem is, before the French Revolution, things are going very, very badly in France. The government is basically bankrupt. The king spent a ton of money on the American Revolution because England was their enemy, and they wanted to see England lose to the American colonists. The only people that get taxed in the country is the third estate, so basically your poorest people are paying virtually all of the taxes. The government overspends money like crazy. So economically the country is in a bad state. So the decision is made to have a meeting of the Estates-General. What is the Estates-General? The Estates-General is basically the French Parliament, all right? You should remember a discussion of the Parliament, maybe from 9th grade. The first country to have a Parliament is England, all right? And if you remember correctly, the Parliament was basically a group of nobles who met and advised the king, all right? The king was still the absolute leader, but these other people could, you know, have some input on his decisions. Anyway, the Estates-General had representatives from each of the three estates. The problem is that each estate had an equal voice in the Estates-General. So what does that mean? That means that, long story short, the third estate always gets outvoted. The first and second estate wanted to keep things the same. They wanted to maintain their privileges, their feudal privileges, so the third estate couldn't make any changes. It was pretty useless. The king ignored them anyway, so the Estates-General hadn't met for hundreds of years. But with all of this kind of economic problems and the country, you know, in the verge of bankruptcy, they scheduled a meeting of the Estates-General. What ends up happening is, once they have this meeting of the Estates-General, the third estate wants to make a lot of changes, okay? They want to change the taxation and things like that. They want the third estate, especially the members of the middle class, want more of a voice in government. What ends up happening is the third estate come to a meeting and they find that the doors are locked. Now, there is some discussion about whether or not this actually happened. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter. What's important is that the third estate feels that they are locked out. They believe they've been locked out of the meeting. So they leave and they actually meet at what's called a tennis court. It's actually a handball court, doesn't matter. They meet at this thing known as the tennis court, and they take what's called the tennis court oath. And what that means is they all promise to continue meeting until a new government is formed. All right? They want a new government that reflects Enlightenment ideas. They want a stronger voice in government, all of this. All right? And they form a new government known as the National Assembly, or the Assembly. All right, so they also start writing a document known as the Declaration of Rights of Man, and this document is filled with Enlightenment ideas. So it includes these ideas about, you know, like John Locke's, that all men have natural rights, that you have a right to life, liberty, and property. They want an end to feudal privileges. All of that is in this document. All right, so as you might imagine, the king is not going to be too thrilled about the idea of a new government taking over. So there is discussion in the streets that the king is going to use his troops to break up the National Assembly to overthrow this new government. And what ends up happening is there is this event known as the storming of the Bastille. This is, now we have the 4th of July in America. In France, they have what's known as Bastille Day, which is in July 14th. And they consider this their Independence Day in the sense that this is the moment when the people of France take this fight, this revolution into their own hands, and they're going to fight to support this new government, all right? A few weeks later, or I can't remember what the thing is, but there's a certain time elapses, and there's more rebellions. A group of French people, it's actually a lot of the women who work in the fish markets. Anyway, they go to the Palace of Versailles, which is outside of France, it's outside of Paris, rather. It's about like, I forget, 10, 15 miles, something like that, outside of Paris. They go to the gates, they end up storming the castle, and the people take the king and queen prisoner. All right, they take them prisoner and they force the king and queen to move to the Tuileries Gardens. Tuileries Gardens are located in Paris. And this is an important moment because they are, once the king and queen are under the control of the French people, the king is forced to sign away a lot of his powers. And now suddenly we go from an absolute monarchy to a limited monarchy, to a constitutional monarchy, that he's forced to sign the Declaration of Rights of Man. So like I said, this is an end to feudal privilege. This is an end to the absolute power of the king. All right. Around this time, as you might imagine, not everybody inside of France is happy about these changes. Clearly, the nobility and the church are going to be unhappy, but other people as well. So you've got people inside of France who are unhappy about the revolution, but you also have people outside of France who are going to fight this. What ends up happening is, first of all, the queen, who is Marie Antoinette, this is Louis XVI's wife. She is from the royal family of Austria. So her family is not going to want to see her arrested. They're not going to be fans of this revolution. In addition, France had been one of the strongest, most powerful countries in Europe. They have the strongest armies. And so a lot of the countries of Europe are like, well, hey, the best time to attack an enemy is when they're weak. And this revolution had weakened France. So what you end up happening is Austria and Prussia. Again, it's Prussia with a P. I did not mispronounce that. If you want to think Prussia, when you hear the word Prussia, you should think Germany, because in a future lesson, you're going to learn how Prussia basically becomes Germany later. But at this point, it's still Prussia. Prussia and Austria team up and they attack France. So you're in this situation where there are enemies inside of France, enemies outside of France. It looks like the revolution is really, really weak. And so what happens is a new revolutionary government takes over. This is known as the National Convention, right? The National Convention forms. And this is where the radicals take power. And they say, all right, we have these enemies attacking us inside and outside of France. We need to put fear into the hearts of our enemies. We need the enemies of the revolution to feel fear. And so this is where you get something known as the Reign of Terror. And this idea that they're going to strike terror in the hearts of people who are enemies of the revolution. And this is where they also form something known as the Committee of Public Safety. So what happens is the National Convention is the very large body. This committee, it's a group of about, I can't remember if it's 10 or 12 people, but this small committee headed up by a guy named Robespierre, they actually rule the country. Really is basically a dictatorship, because they say, all right, because we're in this emergency situation, because we're in this terrible situation, we need to, they basically suspend all of the rights that people had under the Declaration of Rights of Man, and they rule it as a dictatorship. This is the period where they start sending people to get their heads chopped off by the guillotine during this reign of terror. If you're suspected of being an enemy of the revolution, you get your head cut off. And I mean, anything could lead you under suspicion. You could say to somebody, hey, this bread's a little expensive. If one of the spies, there were spies in the streets, they could overhear you saying something like that, that would be enough to get your head cut off. If you say something nice about a nobleman, get your head cut off. you don't even have to do anything wrong. Just somebody else who had been arrested names you as somebody who's against the revolution can be enough to get your head cut off. So people are dying left, right, and center. It's during this period where King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, they are also going to be executed. So during this period, France now becomes a republic, all right? No more monarchy. The government is basically, what it means to be a republic is that the people have representatives, and these representatives of the people make the decisions about the laws. All right, so Reign of Terror continues. Eventually, the French army starts winning victories against the external enemies. All right, this is thanks to this guy Napoleon Bonaparte, all right, very famous. He is this great general. He starts winning the wars against France's enemies. And inside of France, any kind of opposition to the revolution goes away. I mean, naturally, you're cutting off so many heads. You know, people are going to start agreeing with it. Anybody who had been an enemy has been wiped out. So things start calming down. And there's some discussion by some members of the government to say, hey, maybe we should end this reign of terror. Maybe we should bring back the Declaration of Rights of Man, things like that. Robespierre is completely threatened by this. You have to remember, Robespierre is all-powerful during this period, right? In fact, he was so powerful, they had something known as de-Christianization. Long story short, again, if you remember from that, remember the picture at the top of the 3 estates? Remember that first estate had been filled with the clergy, the Roman Catholic clergy. So the church was an enemy to the French Revolution. So during this period of de-Christianization, they actually created a new calendar. All right, this is how far it went, because they wanted to wipe out the power of the church. So they would close down churches, streets that were named after saints were renamed, but they took it to the point where they actually made a new calendar. Because, for example, you know, if you're a Catholic, if you're a Christian even, Sunday is the holy day, right? Well, if you change the calendar and now instead of 7 days in a week, you have 8 days, or I think it was 8 days or 14 days, but they changed the number of days in a week, so you didn't even know when the Sabbath was. You didn't even know when Sunday was because you couldn't keep track anymore. You couldn't celebrate Christmas because they had now changed the calendar where there wasn't 12 months a year. There were like 14 months in the year, and they renamed every month. So these were all attempts to wipe out the power of the Catholic Church. I mean, this is how crazy things got under the Committee of Public Safety, under Robespierre's control. So there was this de-Christianization, there was the Reign of Terror. Anyway, things really take a turn, and the government, the people in the National Convention turn against Robespierre after Robespierre comes to a meeting of the National Convention and says, you know, there are enemies to the revolution, because he saw enemies everywhere. I mean, he was nuts. But he says there are enemies of the revolution inside the convention, and I'm going to come and I'm going to give you a list of these names. And he promises that he's going to have a list of names for people the following day. Naturally, the people in the convention are like, what are we going to do? We're going to sit around here? Who knows who could be on this list? They all know that potentially their names could be on the list, and if they are, their heads are going to get chopped off. So when Robespierre comes back the next day, naturally everybody in the National Convention says, arrest Robespierre. They don't let him speak. They arrest Robespierre, and Robespierre gets his head cut off. He ends up being convicted as an enemy of the revolution. He loses his head in the guillotine, and it is the death of Robespierre that finally ends this reign of terror. All right? And things start to calm down again. You have a new revolutionary government at this point that takes over, known as the Directory. Directory is not that important. It rules for about like 4 or 5 years or something. Not a huge long time. The most important, I mean, it's pretty ineffective. It's pretty corrupt. It doesn't really get anything done. Not anything major of note. The most important thing you need to know about the Directory is that the Directory will be overthrown by Napoleon. Okay? Napoleon Bonaparte is going to have something known as a coup d'etat. All right? You can see the word written at the bottom right of the slide. It looks like it says coup d'etat, but it's actually pronounced, it's a French word. It says coup d'etat. And he's going to overthrow, and that's going to be the end of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution ends with, well, I don't know. It's some people say it ends with Napoleon. It happens during the end. Some people consider Napoleon a continuation of the French Revolution. And the reason why they consider Napoleon a continuation of the French Revolution is that he is going to maintain certain ideas that come out of the French Revolution. Let me show you what I mean. All right. What happens is that when Napoleon takes power, he says, listen, the revolution got rid of certain old ideas which were good. So I'm going to bring those back. But the good ideas that came out of the French Revolution, I'm going to keep. So he brings back some old ideas, but he keeps some of the new ideas. So for example, remember I just told you about the de-Christianization? Napoleon's going to make peace with the Catholic Church. He's going to bring back the Catholic Church. It's not going to be as powerful as it was, but he's going to allow for Catholicism to be practiced. All right, so that's an old idea. An old idea was absolute rule. Right? When Napoleon first takes over, he says, okay, I'm going to name myself first consul, and people vote for him and they elect him. He was this great hero of the revolution. Later, the people elect him first consul for life. After that, Napoleon names himself emperor. So he's going to bring back this idea of absolute rule, right? Which that was against the ideas of the Enlightenment, against the ideas of the revolution, but that he's bringing back, that kind of old idea of having an all-powerful ruler. He maintains a secret police force. Right? These are kind of old ideas of being all powerful. However, the ideas, one of the most powerful things that came out of the French Revolution were those ideas that were in the Declaration of Rights of Man. Specifically, these ideas about the end of feudal privilege. Napoleon is going to keep that. Napoleon was actually born a commoner. He was a soldier who had worked his way up through the army. So he is going to create this Napoleonic Code. That's a code of laws. And this code of laws there is no feudal privilege under Napoleonic Code. All people are equal under the law. In addition, this Enlightenment idea, this revolutionary idea that all people should be entitled to education, he agrees with that. He opens lycees. Lycees are schools, and they're open to everyone. Don't get it twisted. There weren't that many lycees. Supply. The demand for spots in the lycees the demand for those spots were much greater than the supply of schools. But nonetheless, it was a good starting point. Many of the lycees that Napoleon opened are still in operation today, so that was really important. He's going to improve the economy, makes things better for people. What he's really known for, though, is this last piece. You see where it says builds huge empires. Napoleon, again, look at his day job. He worked as a soldier, right? He is going to basically conquer all of continental Europe, right? So that means the whole continent of Europe, that main part of Europe he's going to gain control of. The only part of Europe that he doesn't get control over is England. Why? Well, what's different about England? Dun, 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 dun. It's an island. It's an island. So naturally, Napoleon's army can't march to England. It's separated by water. So, but the rest of Europe, he's able to gain control over. And the control that Napoleon has either is directly conquers it, or Napoleon, he'll either directly conquer it and he adds it to France, or he would put his brothers on the thrones of different places that he controlled, or he would make alliances. So, for example, in Russia, he didn't take over Russia, but he had an alliance so that, he basically, if Napoleon said jump, they said how high. You get what I'm saying? So he has basically control over all the countries of Europe. Things start chugging along pretty well. The big mistake Napoleon makes is something known as the Continental Policy, or sometimes you also think of it as the blockade of Britain. But this Continental Policy, what happens is Napoleon cannot gain control of England. So he says, all right, if I can't break you militarily, I'll break you economically. And Napoleon forbids any of the countries of Europe from trading with England, thinking that that's going to hurt them. Well, England's got a very strong navy. It has tons of colonies. Ends up the Continental Policy hurts these continental European businesses more than it hurts England. And the biggest impact of the Continental Policy is it breaks the relationship between France and Russia. Russia says, look, we're not following the Continental Policy. We're going to trade with England. This is a huge mistake. And once Russia makes that decision, Napoleon says, that's it, I've got to attack Russia. And this is the beginning of the end for him. Because the big mistake Napoleon makes is he marches into Russia in the spring. And, you know, he's winning. But what happens is as the Russian army retreats, they end up burning and destroying all of the farms and all of the supplies in the area as they retreat. So Napoleon's winning and he's moving forward. But the problem is when you march with a huge army, and his army was something like, it was over, you know, it was over 600, I think it was 650,000 people or something. When you march with that many people, you're not bringing food and supplies with you. You got to get supplies from the surrounding area. I mean, you bring some supplies with you, but you have to resupply from as you go. So as the Russians are retreating, they're destroying all of the supplies. So Napoleon's not able to resupply his army. Nonetheless, the French army marches all the way to Moscow, and they get there, and they basically win. But the problem is that now it's turned to winter, and Napoleon needs to get his army back to France. And what happens is now they're marching back to France, and it's the winter, and these guys all have spring uniforms on. They're marching through territory that's been destroyed, so there's no supplies. So his army is basically freezing to death and starving. He loses 500,000 troops. He loses the majority of his army, either through death, desertion, you know, injury, what have you. So his army is destroyed. Attacking Russia. You never attack Russia in winter. Forget the Russian army. The Russian climate will always win. This is going to happen to Napoleon, and later when we study World War II, Hitler's going to make the same mistake because he's an idiot, and so are Nazis. But anyway, so like I said, Napoleon is going to, Napoleon ends up losing his army based on this attack of Russia, and the other armies of Europe say, oh, here's our chance, and Napoleon is defeated, all right? Long story short, he is sent into exile. Napoleon ends up escaping exile from the island of Elba, which is off the coast of Italy. He takes power for 100 days, and then he's defeated again, and then he's exiled to like this country in the middle of nowhere, like off the coast of Africa. And forget it, he dies in exile and it's over. The only other thing I want to talk about really quick, I'm sorry this video is going so long, is the Congress of Vienna. Long story short, like I said, Napoleon had taken control of all of Europe. After Napoleon is defeated, the countries of Europe need to kind of reset the clock. They need to, now that Napoleon is out, there's kind of a vacuum left, so they have to figure out who's going to lead what. So the Congress of Vienna restores the monarchies to Europe. They're going to bring kings and queens back to the thrones of France. They're bringing kings and queens back to Spain, so on and so forth. And the other big thing they need to do is they want to prevent war in the future. And they say the best way to prevent war is to make sure France doesn't get too powerful. But the other big thing they need to do is what they call create a balance of power. As long as all of the countries of Europe are kind of have more or less kind of equal power, no one is going to be in a position to attack someone else because you know, no one is clearly more powerful than anybody else, and that's going to help maintain the peace. And that's the idea of the Congress of Vienna, and it works. I mean, it works until it doesn't work. It's able to maintain peace. There aren't any major large-scale conflicts in Europe until World War I. So like I said, it works until it doesn't. All right, so that is the end. The other thing you need to know about Napoleon Bonaparte is by putting his brother on the throne of Spain, it's going to enable the Latin American revolutions. That's one of the other big impacts that you need to know about Napoleon Bonaparte. I'm going to discuss that, though, more in the next video where I'm going to talk about the Latin American revolutions.